What you are looking at are scenes from downtown Los Angeles, showing clashes between law enforcement and protesters who oppose the government's recent ICE raids within the city. Over the span of just a few days, cars have been lit on fire, shops have been looted, and both police and members of the public have been reported injured. So why are protesters out on the streets? And what can this situation tell us about how the Trump administration is enforcing its ambitious list of immigration-related policies? When President Trump won his second presidency in November of last year, he promised to carry out the largest deportation effort in American history, aiming to deport over 10 million immigrants during his time in office. Since the start of his second term, President Trump has repeatedly made headlines for his heavy-handed approach to deportations, most famously contracting the government of El Salvador to take in detained prisoners at its Secot prison. The prison itself has been made famous for its enormous size and brutal conditions, and many of those deported weren't even convicted of a crime. A private investigation by 60 Minutes couldn't find criminal records for 75% of Venezuelan nationals deported, and in one instance, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a legal US resident, was also deported. Garcia was later ordered back 3 months later to face trial after pressure from the public, and a ruling by the Supreme Court. Although President Trump's deportation policies have proved quite popular among his base, these heavy-handed tactics have sparked criticism among the president's detractors, as well as human rights organizations within the country. With all of this in mind, tensions were already high when ICE agents raided several LA workplaces on the 6th of June, which would end up arresting over 100 people in at least 3 locations across the country. Protests quickly erupted in response to the arrests, and although reports claim that most of those involved have been peaceful, this hasn't always been the case. As the disorganized protests spilled over into the next few days, some protesters would be seen throwing bricks at police, lighting cars on fire, and at least one instance of a Molotov cocktail being thrown at law enforcement officers. Likewise, many commenters have accused some of the attending officers of using unnecessary levels of force, such as one instance caught on camera of an Australian journalist getting hit with a rubber bullet while live on air. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese would later comment on the incident, quote, "It is not acceptable. I respect the role that media play, and people should respect the role that media play in our modern society." By the 10th of June, Reporters Without Borders reported 31 separate attacks on journalists covering the protests, 27 of which being from law enforcement. On the 7th of June, one day after the protest broke out, President Trump would deploy 2,000 National Guard to Los Angeles, which would spark its own political conflict. The National Guard is a hybrid organization that serves both the state and federal levels of government. However, they're typically only called upon at the request of a state's governor. In this instance, the deployment of the National Guard was not requested by California Governor Gavin Newsom, as the president instead enacted a rarely used federal law which argued that the actions of the protesters constituted a, quote, "form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States." Reportedly, this is the first time the National Guard have been called upon without the request of the state's governor since 1965. In that instance, President Lyndon B. Johnson would call upon the Guard to protect anti-segregationist protesters during the civil rights movement, after the governor of Alabama refused to offer them protection. Whether or not these recent protests within LA constituted the mobilization of the National Guard is a contentious topic. Commenting on the state of California filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration, California Attorney General Rob Bonta would go on to call the deployment of the National Guard a, quote, "inflammatory escalation unsupported by the conditions on the ground," and that it exceeds the federal government's authority. President Trump has justified the involvement of the National Guard as an effort to protect federal property and personnel. However, this will likely be an issue for legal experts to hash out over the following months. Another argument employed by the Trump administration has been the use of the Mexican flag, which has become a common symbol among many of the protesters. Once again, whether this is evidence of a foreign invasion or rebellion will likely be up to the courts. We should also keep in mind that the current state of the LA protests is relatively small. According to reporting by the Associated Press, as of time of writing, the protests have mostly been contained to a 5-block stretch of downtown LA. On the 9th of June, President Trump sent 2,000 National Guard and, more notably, 700 Marines to LA. US officials stated that the Marines had been deployed to protect federal property and personnel, including federal immigration agents. Posting on Twitter, Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth wrote, quote, "Due to increase threats to federal law enforcement officers and federal buildings, approximately 700 active-duty US Marines from Camp Pendleton are being deployed to Los Angeles to restore order. While legal analysts were trying to figure out the legality of deploying active-duty Marines to LA, military experts were raising concerns about potentially using a nation's military against its own citizens. It should be noted that Marines were previously mobilized in LA during the 1992 LA riots. However, the circumstances for deployment were much more extreme. In that case, the Marines were deployed by the request of the governor of California, and the riots had led to the deaths of 50 people and caused $1 billion in damage. Commenters critical of President Trump speculate that he sent the National Guard and Marines to LA specifically to manufacture a crisis. They argue that the forces being sent against the wishes of the state are intended to escalate the size and intensity of the protests and drive a wedge between the partisan military and the protesters. Commenting on the protests, President Trump stated that he needed to, quote, liberate Los Angeles from a migrant invasion, and that he would not allow an American city to be invaded and conquered by a foreign enemy. During the protests, President Trump also repeatedly referred to the protesters as insurrectionists, which experts believe may indicate an intention to invoke the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act greatly expands federal authority to deploy military or National Guard troops to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion. Critics of President Trump believe he wants to escalate the protests with federal enforcement, paint the protesters as lawless criminals, and use this protest as an example of why the administration's heavy-handed immigration policies are so necessary. Whether you actually subscribe to this theory will probably depend on how much you happen to like the president. But despite his actual intentions, the introduction of federal law enforcement appeared to escalate the protests. On the ground, many protesters see the deployment of the National Guard and Marines as an extension of the heavy-handed policies they were already protesting. Looking at a poll from YouGov covering 4,000 US adults, we can see that only 36% of respondents approve the protests within LA, with 45% disapproving and 19% remaining undecided. As we mentioned, this fell pretty heavily within party lines, with Democratic-aligned respondents much more likely to approve rather than their Republican counterparts. However, YouGov also found that more respondents disapproved of the deployment of the National Guard than those who supported it. Interestingly, despite being a pretty major escalation in a legal sense, respondents rated very similar sentiment for the deployment of Marines. As of time of writing, the protests have remained relatively contained, and despite the number of arrests now creeping into the hundreds, there's fortunately been no loss of life among anyone involved. If the protests end up escalating, we'll be sure to include follow-up coverage for our regular news episode at the end of the month. We'd once again like to thank our wonderful Patreon supporters for making this video possible. And until next time, cheers for watching.